Hello students, this is your instructor, George Maniotis, and I'm talking today about Chapter 16, Overthrowing the Political and Social Order. And really what this chapter is about is the French Revolution. So, please stand by as we discuss this most pivotal chapter today. When we're going to talk about the French Revolution, it would be imperative for us to start and look at maybe a little bit about the American Revolution, which has occurred not even 20 years before, and the origins of that. Remember, that was 1776. The French Revolution will kick off in 1789, 13 years later. We will talk about the early phases of the revolution today. We'll talk about the Reign of Terror, how the revolution begins to fall apart, and we have warfare between various groups. We'll talk about a consolidation of power into a small oligarchy. An oligarchy is ruled by a few. We'll also talk about Napoleon, who will emerge from that oligarchy as its sole emperor or dictator. And we will talk about his eventual fall and restoration. We're talking about roughly a 100-year period of history and how this all interfaces. So this is kind of important to understand. Don't get too concerned if this all seems overwhelming. Best thing to do is to dissect each piece, try to understand it, and then try to fit it together into a bigger picture. So what is the problem? Well, France is in tremendous trouble. It has now fought 3 wars. And let's go through the litany of wars that it has fought. And every time I tell you the word war, you should just see big dollar signs falling out of a rich person's pocket by the bucketful. And that's how it is today even. The United States has been embroiled in a war for 10 plus years. All we know is we're hemorrhaging dollars every month to a place called Afghanistan. Prior to that was Iraq and Afghanistan. And very little benefit is received by the people. Now you might say, well, don't they spend money on defense weapons, etc.? Yeah, but that's a minor part of it. Maybe the employment in the defense industry is doing well, but in general, the public is doing poorly. And think about all the things that we have to give up during a period of war that really benefit the people. Perhaps maybe your financial aid has been cut in the last few years, or there's less money being spent on local schools or something to that effect because the government has no money to give them. That's all because of the war. Well, the same thing's going on in France. France has now fought 3 consecutive wars, starting in 1740, ending in 1781 with the American Revolution. It has been unsuccessful in 2, semi-successful in a 3rd, but it doesn't get what it needs, and it's a problem. What France wanted in the American Revolution was probably a restoration of its former colonies that they had lost in the French and Indian War, or what we call the 7-Year War in Europe. That doesn't happen. So France has lost considerable territory and has spent considerable amount of money out of its treasury to fight a war. And it's also seeing a king, or a series of kings, that are spending like sailors on shore leave. Anything that suits their fancy, they're buying and enjoying, and the nobility around them also love everything about it. So the question then becomes, how do you raise money for your treasury? Remember ultimately that the king in a monarchy is responsible for the treasury. He or she must set the taxes for the country, they collect them, and they must see that they're dispensed. Not unlike what we see today in the United States with our president, who is the executive officer of the country. He's responsible for setting the budget, proposing the taxes, and also collecting and dispensing the money. So the taxation system in France at this time is broken. Most of the taxation is falling on the poorest people, the serfs and peasants, followed by the middle class. The wealthy have gotten off over the years with paying very little taxes, yet enjoying all of the fruits of the labor of the poor. And now France must confront the situation, especially under the reign of King Louis XVI, who has taken over for King Louis XV. How do we try to balance the books? And of course, just like the United States today, such great parallels between these two periods of time, it's almost scary. How do we raise enough money to keep the system going? Because nobody's comfortable about talking about cutting anything out. And that's what's going to be also facing the French like the United States today. What can you do without? Everybody's gotten so used to everything, to propose even any cuts seems to be fallacy or heresy. So this is going to be an issue. Now, what is the problem? Well, there's the underlying causes of the revolution that we'll see. First, we're going to see the nobility who do not want to pay their fair share start to rise up. They're also very frustrated. They've lived in a system of great privilege, many of them living at Versailles with the king, oftentimes in contempt of the king. They look at the king and they think, why can't that be me? I'm smarter than he is. Obviously, I haven't been a member of the Royal Sperm Club, therefore I'm never going to be king, and I'm frustrated by that. And that becomes a problem, because many times, as we see in cases where there's a posse of people leading behind a rich person, we know that the rich person is often keeping them on their back, keeping them under their thumb, or exploiting them. But the posse also exploits the rich person as well. They are hangers-on. They spend their money. They're happy to party with them, but they're also jealous of them. And that's part of the nobility as well. There's a great jealousy of the king. Now, the other thing is middle-class demands are also going to rise. Remember, we're talking about the merchants and the small industrialists who are making money. And they're making money, and they're replenishing their wealth, and they're expanding at a time when the nobility has oftentimes been stagnant in terms of their wealth accumulation. And they're frustrated as well. And they think that they should also be getting political rights. Many of them can't vote. Many of them have little or no opportunity for titles. And they feel very jealous of the nobility. Now, the other thing we have to take into account, we have just been exposed to and have seen the undertaking of a great Enlightenment period, with people like Montesquieu, Hume, Voltaire, and Rousseau spreading their ideas and their concepts through the general public. One of them, Locke, of course, the idea of the social contract, that the government should reflect the values of the people, and if it does not, it should be changed, just like any good contract. You contract for a service, and you should get what you ask for. Well, that's not the case in France at this time. Nobody's getting what they want. Nobody's seeing what they want. So they're becoming frustrated. And there's also a great amount of disappointment in terms of expectations at this time. People are expecting that France should be progressing, should be still the most powerful country in Europe, and they're seeing that diminish over time to England, and they're becoming irritated with this whole thing. And that's not going to be a good thing as well. So we're going to see this irritation continue, and it's not going to lead itself to the proper place where we hope to see. Now, the other things we're going to start seeing here are demands for political participation. And this is going to be a very critical element as well. The rich are going to want and desire the vote. They're going to want to have a say as to how their taxes are leveled and other things. And that's not going to be happening at this time in France. So they feel like the cartoon that you're going to see in figure 16.1 on page 518 of your book. You see a naked man in chains being ridden by a king, by the nobility, and also by the clergy. And they're going to feel like they're being pretty much exploited. They're going to be ridden on by everybody else. Now, the other thing that we see going on is the economy has deteriorated in France. Starting in the 1770s, there's a series of economic depressions that hit the country, and frustrations begin to rise. In the 1780s, we begin to also see this coupled up with the prospect of bad grain harvests, which are going to drive that commodity bread prices up tremendously, thus putting out of the average person's hands the amount of money that he or she could collect for their food, and that's going to be an issue. Now, the final item, of course, is the unpopular kings. There are three kings in a row that have spent money very, very strongly. One of them is, of course, King Louis XIV, but he's popular. He's maintained his decorum, caused the country to expand, put money into the coffers, even though he was spending money like it was going out of style. But this is not the case with King Louis XV, whose reign was plagued by sex scandals and economic woes and bad efforts in terms of wars and stuff. This is not happening. And it's also not happening with King Louis XVI, his successor, who is trying to manage an alliance between the nobility and his assets, and he's having a hell of a time doing it. And the other thing that makes King Louis XVI unpopular is he marries an Austrian wife, part of the noble family of Austria. And over the years, if we've been studying, we know that France and Austria have been fighting, and it's not a good situation. So when he brings his Queen Marie Antoinette to Versailles, here's a girl that struggles speaking French. She has some great issues in terms of her lifestyle. She expects to live at a very haughty lifestyle, very high level, and the kind of economic elements aren't there, and this is going to cause unrest later on as well. Now, there is a YouTube video here implanted. I don't know if this link is working, but I also have set up another link in the learning module for YouTube. Please look at that. That gives you the underlying visual elements for the French Revolution. I think it's also nice to be able to see those things and to get a little handle on them. Now, the slide is entitled, "Where's the Money?" And I think that's pretty much the case, because by 1774, the nobility, especially the king, knows the treasury is depleting, and he's going to start analyzing, what is it going to take in order for me to get this thing under control? So he starts by analyzing where his money supply is going. And he's going to start this with the notion of we need to start handling our cash. And how can we do it in a more effective manner? Well, one of the things he does is he takes and he appoints a finance minister. This is in 1774 that King Louis has done this. So he starts to look at how we can start getting the finances in order. So Jacques Turgot is appointed the finance minister, and he looks at the money, and he looks at the resources, and he looks at the expenditures. Kind of like today, looking at the taxes coming in, looking at the money being spent, looking at the potential for cuts. And what he recommends is some changes. One, to the guilds, that there should be some changes to those middle class institutions that are doing the manufacturing in terms of taxes. Putting new taxes on the land, which is going to hit right solely onto the rich, and to start implementing some reforms with the court. Now, we're not talking the justice court here. We're talking the court at Versailles, cutting off some of these people that have been hanging on 2 and 3 generations on the king's dime, because remember that King Louis XIV wanted all of his nobility to be close at hand, living at Versailles under his thumb. And one of the things that will derail this concept and not lead to its implementation is the fact that the war against England will sprout out, and France will become involved by 1778 with the American colonists. And there are also going to be complaints from the people that are going to be suffering the cutbacks at the court. What do you mean we're getting cut off? We got to go out and find our own way. We've been doing this for thousands, or not thousands of years, but quite literally 100 plus years. We've been living at Versailles. This is the king's duty to keep us on the payroll, to take care of us, to keep us in our usual lifestyle. How dare he even imagine cutting us off? So the kind of the same chatter that you hear today. The country gets preoccupied in bigger issues, and nobody's watching the pennies, so to speak. Spend the dollars, but don't watch the pennies, and then leads to bigger issues. Now, the country, as we say, goes through a whole series of economic woes. It's not one thing that takes the country down. Like I say to my students each semester, it's not like they all woke up one morning and said to themselves, hey, guess what? It's a good morning for a revolution. Let's all get out of bed and cause riots and decapitate kings and the nobility and all this kind of stuff. People don't get to that point in one day or 1 year. It's a series of years and times and frustrations that will mount, that will cause people to get unhappy. And I always caution students, look at our current state of affairs. There's great parallels between the French Revolution and many of the things that are going on in the United States today that should make us concerned. Number one, these economic depressions that were hitting in France in the 1770s, where France has lost much of its triangular trade, especially the loss of its American colonies in North America. That whole fur trade that was constructed is now gone to heck. It's no longer there. That revenue has been lost. France's colonies have been diminished in the Caribbean and other places, so they're not making money on rum and other things that they had been making. And this is coupled with a series of poor harvests and other concerns that are going to affect the most common people. One of the things that you see is when people can't feed themselves and they feel unable to control their future, people start getting extremely edgy. And this is manifested in France because folks have to eat. Sorry, people, if you don't eat, you'll be the same way. You'll be upset. And this is something that we have to constantly keep under our thumb. What happens when people don't eat? What happens when people don't get the ability to sustain themselves? Well, they usually turn out and riot, steal, cause disarray, and that's going to be a problem that we will see during the 1780s, in the 1770s and 1780s, as the price of bread skyrockets. There are food riots. People will break into bakeries. They will break into granaries. They will be looking for a scarce commodity. Remember that the average Frenchman about this time is eating between a pound and a pound and a half of bread a day to sustain himself. That's quite a bit of bread. You know, today you don't eat a loaf of bread every day, but that was the main staple for most people at the time. So they're eating bread. Bread is a cheap commodity, something that they can control. It has a long shelf life, something that is of essence to all the people at the time. So when bread becomes unavailable, it's hard. Mommy, I'm hungry. The average French unskilled worker made between 15 to 30 sous a day. Now, if you were to equate a sou to a fraction of what we call a dollar today, they were making between 15 and 30 cents a day at best. A family of four needed to buy loaves of bread each day to sustain themselves. Could be between 3 and 4 loaves of bread a day in some cases. Look at what happens to the price of bread. It's going to nearly double in 1 year's time. So if you're only making 30 sous a day on the top end, and your bread prices go from 9 sous to 15 sous per loaf, it's now costing you more to eat than you make. And this is going to cause a series of famines, especially in the late 1780s. People are hungry, the harvests are terrible, and there is no prospect for relief, and it hasn't come to the attention, or it hasn't been dealt with by the rich, especially the king, because they've been insulated from all of this. Living in Versailles, they don't know what the score is on a daily basis. So this is part of what we talk about in terms of our situation. The nation has gone through a tremendous blow here, the French nation, and the nobility has not addressed the issue. They think it's a joke. They're laughing away. Ha ha ha. Partying, taking care of business at the castles and at the royal court, but not taking care of the people. Now, the other thing you have to look at is who's bearing most of this burden. Who's paying most of the taxes and doing most of the work and getting little in return? Well, the peasants are. Look at what they do. 10% of their income was obligated to the church, as in terms of a tithe. That meant that every peasant was expected to go to church. This idea that, this modern idea, well, let's go to buffet or whatever, we're going to sit at home and we're not a member of a church, or we have no spiritual orientation. Maybe we go to country buffet as our church instead of, to meet with family and to just gather instead of going to a religious service. That wasn't true back then. And people were expected on Sunday to be in church. And going to church required that you pay your fair share. 10% was levied by the church in terms of a tithe. I meant 10% of what you made in terms of money as well as product was given to the church. This was done because the fact was the church required resources. Like all churches today, can't work or can't have a ministry without people paying. They have to pay for the preacher, they have to pay for the buildings, they have to pay for other things, and that's going to be a big issue. 10% off the top to the church. On top of that, there's the land tax to the state, the taille they call it. Now look at this. They've got a 10% for the tithe, now they have to pay a land tax for the church. They also had to pay a tax on the number of people in the family. So as many peasant families, of course, had to be large because the work was very arduous. Now you're paying by the head. So if you have 8-10 people in your family because it's essential for the farm, you got to pay tax on each member in the family. Imagine that today, paying a tax on the number of people in your family. Kind of have that a little bit today, except in the other extreme. Have more family members, you get a bigger deduction from your income. That's not the case in France. It's the opposite way. You get taxed if you have more people. Now, the other thing is the landowners, the rich nobility, required the peasants or the serfs to give them at least 2 to 3 days a week in forced labor. In other words, build roads, build walls for the castle, take care of the nobility's projects. So on top of doing your own work, you were expected to help 2 to 3 days a week the landlord. So you don't only do your work, you're doing a landlord's work. Think about it. That's part of that 96 hours of work that we keep talking about in this course that the average peasant is doing in a week. 16 times 6, 96 hours. Yeah, that's the landlord's work is part of that. Now, the other thing is, some people also required the peasants to pay in cash for their land. This is called cens. Not as frequent. Oftentimes it was on a sharecropping basis, which is the champar, which is the payment in production, up to 30 to 40% of the crop paid to the landlord. Wow. Wonder why the peasants aren't happy. They're doing all the paying. Who's speaking on their behalf? How many votes do they get? What sort of representation in the royal court do they have? None. And you'll wonder why eventually people get upset. Well, you keep leveling taxes, you keep forcing us to pay more, yet our voices keep being diminished or not heard, and we're going to get tired of doing this. And that's going to be the thing that's going to sink the French. There's just too many people with their hand out at the lowest elements of the society, expecting them to continue to pay. This is the picture I alluded to earlier. One picture says it all. Look at this. This is the working man in chains, being led like a horse, ridden by the king, by the clergy, and by the nobility. Many people felt this was the way they were being addressed. Now, another thing we begin to see is that the system begins to fall apart and fall apart quickly. One of the elements that begins to happen is that starting with King Louis XVI, we not only have the issue of these depressions occurring, but we also have the concept of where to get the money. He's under a severe crunch. One of the problems is his wife is spending crazily. They're expanding Versailles. She's spending a lot on clothing, hairdos, etc. A lot of this is happening at a time when the French have no money themselves. And what they need to do is raise the taxes. The nobility doesn't want to raise taxes. They don't want to spend any money. They don't want to do any of the things they need to do to pass on these things. So there is a finance problem. Now, the king has to address this. He goes to the court, says, you need to help me raise the money. They say, well, we are not in a position to raise taxes. In fact, the last time when the taxes were raised, back in 1614, there was a body called the Estates General that was convened by the king and had representation from 3 levels of the society. One level will be the clergy, that's called the first estate. The second level will be the nobility, the second estate, and the third level will be all the rest, the people. So what King Louis proceeds to do, he starts to think about how do we get this States General up, and what should we be discussing, how should we deal with this. We got to deal with this once and for all. Now notice, you got to give King Louis some credit here in the 16th. He's attempting to find a global situation to the problem. Not like the American Congress that keeps passing stopgap measures to try to get through one little crisis to the next little crisis, little band-aids, and never addressing the major wound. So what does he do? He dispatches his members of his administration to go to the people and to assemble a carrier de doléances. These are what we call grievances. What's bugging you about the government? What should we change? What should we address? And he comes back, these people come back with tons of lists. Remember, this is not a great administration. People aren't loving this group by all means. So they go out and they start looking at how do they try to address this issue. And what they find is that people are upset as well. They're really angry. Now remember that the way this Estates General was constituted, nobility get 1 vote, the clergy get 1 vote. Well, who are they most likely to vote with? Well, they're going to vote for preserving the current system because they're benefiting it. And the people, everybody else, and we're not talking the serfs here, the third estate is really only going to represent the richest of the rich middle class, not the peasant in the field. But these people are irritated, they want power, but they're not natural allies of the king. So it's always going to be 2-1 in favor of the king here. This is kind of a rigged system. So what happens? The people go out, they get these lists, And what they find is, my, oh my, oh my, there are all kinds of things in here. People are red hot, they're irritated, and they're going to start to address these issues. They at least try to address these issues. So here's the situation. In terms of size, the three groups, the first estate, the second estate is roughly about the same size, but the third estate is going to have more seats available for its representatives because it represents 80 to 90% of the population. However, each group only gets one vote, and that's going to be an issue. So there's a total of about 600 representatives that are seated in this body, the Estates General. Most of these people are all rich. Remember, even the people in the third estate have to be wealthy, because who can stop working to go to a meeting that's going to be taking place starting in April of 1789 to address the issues of complaints that have been accumulating for years? One of the things that people begin to discuss is maybe there's a need for a constitutional government with a national assembly. Remember that France has been, up to this date, a divine right country. Everything has come from the king. There's been very little input from the nobility in most sense. So what we start to see is there's a desire to change the structure. But who's going to be blocking this? Well, the king. The king feels very threatened by this, so we need to keep our eye on this element. Now, what we call the growth of the bourgeois. Now, the bourgeois is the rich classes, nobility, clergy, and we're not talking Father Pat down at the parish, the local parish. We're talking the bishops, archbishops, cardinals. And we're also looking at this huge growing middle class, especially upper middle class, who are wealthy beyond belief because of their businesses, etc., have been making money steadily but have been shut out. So about 9% of the population would fall in this bourgeois class. 91% do not. But the problem is this 9%, King Louis XVI has failed to be able to make inroads with them. They don't feel comfortable with him. They don't like him. They don't sense that he's a good guy. And this is always going to be a problem for him. They just don't like the fact that he's not perceived as being in touch with them. Part of it is, it looked like King Louis XVI had some antisocial tendencies. Maybe he had what we would call today a mild form of autism. Probably didn't relate well with social situations. Smart, astute in the sense, but not able to consummate things in terms of his public. Other thing is, there's also scandal brewing in the court. King Louis has married his wife, Marie Antoinette, and they're having a little problem with the baby department. Yes, King Louis hasn't been doing his homework. Apparently, he suffers from a medical issue that makes him unable to perform in the marital bed, so to speak. Apparently, he had an early case of what we call erectile dysfunction. Don't want to be imprudent here or get into things a little deeply, but it'll be years before they discover the underlying causes of his problem. So the scandal starts brewing that maybe the queen is sleeping about, she's a slut, and King Louis isn't doing his duties. And, all kinds of stuff starts emanating, because back then, having babies is so important, especially having male heirs is going to be an issue. And that's going to be a consistent problem with King Louis XVI. So, going back here to the Estates General, we've had an issue now. The king doesn't want to give up power. The nobility want power. The third estate wants to change everything because they don't feel the thing is working well. So between April of 1789 to May of 1789, the issues about how they should be seated and how they should be dealt with are constantly being dealt with in a unique fashion. So these people are sitting at Versailles with the king, meeting at Versailles, and they're wrangling and they're arguing, and nothing seems to get taken care of. In fact, there's many meetings between the Estates General and the king to try to get this process going. But what happens is there is no consensus. And what will happen is for 6 weeks of back and forth, eventually the process will begin to fall apart. First of all, Louis wasn't able to make his mind up. And secondly, the Third Estate, backed with some members now of the First and Second Estate, some of the more liberal nobility and clergy, took action and declared themselves the National Assembly of France. In other words, they threw this Estates General right out the window and said, now let's have an assembly that's representative. We don't care what the king says, let's just do it. Problem is, where are they meeting? Versailles. They attempt to go back on June 17th to meet as the National Assembly, and suddenly they find the king has locked them out of their meeting facilities. Their room that they're supposed to have met at is locked. Quickly, they look around for other available venues. They find a tennis court, which is really like a huge racquetball court. They played squash indoors. And they're going to meet on that tennis court, and they're going to administer an oath that they took, vowing not to disband until France gets a constitution. This is the biggest thing. We're going to take a little pause here. I want to render this up for you. And this will be section 1. We'll come back in just a second here.